Warning, this video will not recap the plot of Manabi Straight. If you want to understand the vast majority of this video, I suggest you go watch that show. In the meantime, I'll be talking about it. So we should get to that. Yeah! So I just finished Manabi Straight by Studio Ufotable, and I really loved it, and coincidentally have a lot to say about it. The thing about this series is that by its plot synopsis alone, it doesn't look like there is anything special about the show. But what keeps it amazing throughout, despite not looking all that stellar on paper, is the great directing, the characters, and the setting that evolves as the show goes on. Having watched the show in 2 days, episodes 1 through 6.5 the first, and 7 through 12 the second, I can say that the two parts are extraordinary for very different reasons. When doing some minimal research on the series, I discovered that there was no central director during the production. This was probably less surprising than it felt, as the first and second parts of the series had largely different goals and tones. That, of course, would be even more obvious if I was in any way familiar with Ufotable's pre-Fate series work, as large tonal shifts were apparently the norm. However, this doesn't explain why shows like Futakoi Alternative, which I'm told have even more obvious, unexplainably bizarre tonal shifts, have directors while this show doesn't. That isn't to say the show isn't amazing the way it is, it's just an interesting tidbit I discovered online. Looking into it, it appears that the closest thing this series had to a director was Takayuki Hirao's involvement with the first 9 episodes. This man worked as a storyboarder for episodes 2 through 9, episode director for 1, 2, 4, and 5, while doing key animation for 1, 2, 3, and 5. While I'm not presumptuous enough to think that he single-handedly made the show what it ended up being, I do think that at the very least he had a large part in it, specifically in the first part of the series. Throughout the first part of this video, I'll be referring to the showmakers and certain aesthetic choices they made to enhance the quality of their scenes. I believe that many of the decisions were made by Takayuki Hirao, but I have no evidence besides the fact that of every episode director, he directed the most episodes, so I'm not going to pretend he was entirely responsible. With that in mind, I'll be focusing the majority of my time covering the strengths of the first part of the series, and going episode by episode showing you exactly what makes this show tick for me, in keeping with this Let's Get Talking. Episode 1 is all about Manabi, an optimistic, ungraceful, and passionate transfer student, who works as the character who pushes the story along. Her first introduction is done with her literally falling out of the sky, the camera lingering on her as she falls, as a kind of visual cue that this student is special. Digi Bro, in his Diary of an Anime Lived on the series, makes the very apt comparison between Manabi and Kamina from Gurren Lagann. Not only are the two characters obviously similar on a surface level, each being able to rouse crowds with fervent, passionate speeches, while secretly knowing less about the situations they're preaching about than they're letting on. But these characters are also similar on a cinematic level, specifically in how they're framed in shots like these, both looking down at the camera from higher points of elevation, having the sun in the background radiate off of them, almost to make them look somewhat godly. This is Cinematography 101 for, this character is noteworthy, keep an eye on them. For the first episode, there are tons of specific moments where the showmakers attempt to portray Manabi as a character who takes advantages of opportunities to wrestle with expectations as much as possible. Like this moment near the beginning of the episode, where the administrators of the school's swimming tournament are complaining about how the student populace doesn't seem to be filled with much spirit, and like 30 seconds later, Manabi literally crashes onto the scene and becomes the most enthusiastic person participating in the event. Or this moment where Mika is asking for volunteers to take open student council positions, but the audience is sleeping and Manabi again crashes onto the scene, voicing her desire to become the student council president. Let's not forget the scene where the principal tries to say that maybe it's a bit weird that Manabi would be the student council president, given that she was a transfer student, that it was her first day, and that she might not completely understand how the student council works at Seiyo, only to be shut down when Manabi bursts into a frankly inspirational speech about how the student council is to work to make student memories of Seiyo unforgettable. When Manabi sings the school's anthem, everybody is genuinely shocked at how actually pretty good it is. All of these scenes are meant to convey the idea that Manabi is reinvigorating what has long been gone from this school, and that's pride. When she is elected to student council presidency, Manabi just smiles and screams her signature line. The second episode serves mostly as an establishment of the relationship between Manabi and Mika. The two become very friendly towards each other, seeing as they are the only members of the student council, and the camaraderie between the two is palpable. For the first part of the episode, the two are rarely seen outside the same frame, and the other characters comment that the two seem really close. This episode serves as a mostly feel-good working together story. On one level, the shared effort of our protagonists to get the student council neat and tidy, and on another level, the shared effort of the entire school to remodel the student council as a cafe of sorts. Manabi, with the help of Momo's inclination to publicize the event, inspires the school by voicing her simple desire to just build an area where everyone can hang out. While there isn't much to say about this episode, there sure as hell is a lot to feel. When watching this episode again to write about it, I couldn't help but sink into my seat and cling my blanket close, which I feel is a special reaction and shouldn't be taken too lightly. However, the episode does accomplish the task of introducing Student Council President of Sister School Aiko High, Takako, into the narrative. One thing I really appreciate about episode 3 is how it handles Takako's presence within the show. Takako is taller than any other student in the series, someone to be looked up to. She's reserved and quiet, but permeates class. The thing is though, the show goes to almost great lengths to make sure that Takako shows very little emotion. The most we get is an obviously practiced smile, and it's not like she acts that way by her own nature. The show implies that she is a victim of circumstance, and that it's her surroundings that affect her personality. I mean, come on, look at her office. It has an entire wall that's a window, which would suggest an aura of freedom within, but all that comes out of the window is a wall of light, which recedes into the office, making what should feel open, claustrophobic at best. The interior of the room does little to brighten spirits either, as the color choice is a mixture between drab blues and dull grays. As a point of contrast, one of the few instances of genuine emotion erupting from Takako's face is when she walks into Seo's student council office and gawks at how bright, welcoming, and happy it is. Another reason why she's probably not used to such energy from her contemporaries is due to the fact that every proposal she receives for Aiko's school fair has already been pre-screened for adherence to school rules and regulations, so even if there were exciting proposals, she never sees them. However, what really nails her personality into the coffin and makes it completely understandable is the fact that when Manabi suggests that the student councils of the area strive to make their student populace have fun and be filled with excitement, none of the other schools know what she's talking about. Fun? Excitement? Obviously, this is a foreign concept to Takako. What I find even more interesting is Takako's influence on the rest of the group, as the aura she gives off is completely bought into by the Seo Student Council. While more energetic and fun ideas are foreign to Takako, this kind of anal retentive sophistication that makes up Takako's school fairs are completely foreign to Manabi and company. They all share an immediate respect for her as a person, enough to look at the kind of fairs she puts on and immediately want to do the same. It's actually a big moment of character growth on Manabi's part to realize that Takako wanted to tell them that they should make the school fair they want to, not the one they think they should. Which of course brings me to the scene which I believe is necessary to focus on when talking about episode 3. Manabi is explaining her revelation to her friends and tells them that they could put on any school fair they want to. She continues to specify that everything they could do is blank right now. This prompts the background to be filled in with white canvas. She goes on about the possibilities of what they could do and sprouts wings and a new dress to become the goddess of this imagination, and states that they are the ones who can draw this school fair however they want to, as the canvas fills in with crayon drawings. The fact that it's a perfect visual representation of what Manabi is feeling right now, something vague and ill-defined but nonetheless bright, colorful, and happy, and something that needs to be shared, is a genius decision on the part of the showmakers. The way Manabi flies with her wings gives off the feeling of floatiness. Obviously, Manabi probably doesn't know what flying is actually like, but understands that it's something like this. It's something that's felt in the visceral sense more than understood. What the scene is trying to convey is that at this stage, the planning stage, anything is possible, and that creative possibilities are endless. Manabi and gang come to understand that they shouldn't strap themselves into a singular formula by which to run the school fair, and instead try to make this the best school fair they've ever put on. Anyway, on to episode 4, which starts off by immediately differentiating itself from the previous episodes, with its off-kilter color scheme and downright Akiyuki Shinbo levels of visual flair and aesthetic. This kind of tone is immediately fitting with the kind of paranoid mindset Mei is in for the duration of the opening scene. Look at how Mei visualizes what appears to be reams of children pushing her into a class representative job she doesn't want, when if you look at the board, it's obvious only 25 students voted to nominate her. This is the first episode to focus on character flaws within the main cast, and the rest of the episodes I talk about in this video do more to contribute to the idea that every one of our cast members has some character flaws that need to be fixed about them, but by hanging out with one another they become better as people. Before we break into the meat of this episode, let's break apart its use of one of my favorite ways of characterizing through shot composition. What I call a contextual flip, but I'm sure there's a better term for it. There's this moment in the opening scene where May is overwhelmed with how many responsibilities have been dropped on her, and she cries on the floor under the silhouette of a window, which is framed in a way to make it almost look like prison bars, visually cueing the audience into the fact that this position is a trap that can't be escaped. Since only she is under the bar, this reinforces the idea that this is her burden alone to bear. The showmakers throw in a plane leaving behind a smoke trail in the shot to ground it in a way, to remind the audience that this isn't just an unintentional framing of events. If, however, there was any doubt that it was intentional or not, an almost identical shot occurs in the last scene of the episode. This is of course where the context change comes in, as May, by the end of the episode, has gotten over her PTSD surrounding her bad junior high experiences, and has realized that she can trust her friends not to take advantage of her. This is conveyed visually by calling back to the shot from earlier, and using its basic template in a different fashion. We have the same objects being used: the window, the camera aimed downward, and the airplane leaving a smoke trail to connect the two scenes together. This time, however, we're seeing this from outside the building, only able to perceive the reflection of the window, which conveys the idea that May is outside this issue. What once affected her on an internal level, she has now removed herself entirely from, and it's no longer a problem for her. This is the first episode where the school's sedentary nature is acknowledged by Manabi and gang, which actually functions as a really interesting way of establishing the conflict of trying to get the school involved in something, namely participation in the school fair. When the gang becomes too reliant on May to help them out, it understandably provokes a psychotic episode, and it actually leads to one of the coolest visual metaphors in the entire series. As May is having a flashback, she pushes her friends out of the frame, trying to separate herself from the group, keeping herself away from the unwanted responsibility by receding into a black box of nothingness. When she snaps out of her illusion, reality confronts her, and she is recognizably disgusted, and this time keeps herself from being dragged into a chore she'll probably hate. When Mutsuki grabs Manabi's hand, it actually made me realize that Mutsuki and May have a history together. And when thinking back to what everyone was saying to trigger May's episode, Mutsuki was the only one who hadn't said anything questionable, which is the kind of detail that only comes to light on a second watch. I really like this moment where May is spying on the group just as Manabi explains her interest in May as a person, and while she's laying down this emotional speech, the show does this cool thing where Manabi is staring directly into the webcam, even though it's obvious that she has no idea that May is spying on her. So it's delivered in a way that implies Manabi is talking to May entirely in spirit, which is kind of made obvious when May reaches into the computer and becomes a ghostly figure spectating the team collaborating on the CG promotional video. She is portrayed to be quite literally with the group in spirit. I think the fact that the show staff put so much thought into presentation and conveyance specifically into this episode is deserving of major praise. Episode 5 serves as a bonding episode between May and Mika, two characters who have completely different approaches to social interaction. May, of course, being shy, and Mika being somewhat extroverted. This reminds me of that episode of K-On! Where Ritsu and Mugi get to spend some quality time together just being buddies. And that's really what this episode is about, becoming buddies. This episode even sets up this cool dichotomy between friends and buddies. Friends are just people who you hang out with on a collective or impersonal level, while buddies are people who you can bond with privately and get to know each other on a deeper than direct level. The theme of the episode is the theme that gets chosen for the school fair, which is an appreciated bit of thematic cohesion coming from the show. The different natures of the two leads in this episode is nicely summed up right here. This shot demonstrates that there is a legitimate interest on both sides to start a friendly companionship. Other than that, this episode is much like episode 2 in that there isn't much to talk about, but at the end of the day it leaves a largely positive feeling with the viewer. On to episode 6. Growing up is a double-edged sword of progression through life. On one hand, you may become more mature and gain insight that's impossible to come by or even comprehend as a child. On the other hand, when you grow older, you tend to grow apart from those who you once considered to be close friends. You may stop paying attention to the people you're close to and start to grow apart from them until it's too late and all you're left with is the sentiment, "Hey, remember John? He was a cool guy." Mika's dilemma in this episode is that she starts to notice she isn't keeping up with Mutsuki's personal life as much as she used to, and she feels like they're drifting apart. She reflects on her past and is confronted by all the friends that she's passed by in her life. She's struck by just how many people she's left behind in growing up. When one is confronted with this kind of realization, it can be a jarring and emotional moment, and Mika does the only human thing and breaks into tears. I can't help but think back to all the friends I've left behind in my life, a lot of people who I've cared about and some who I'm better off without. These memories either bring heartache or a cringe or two, remembering how much of a shithead I was. It's all just an endless cycle that repeats itself with no regard for those it affects. But hey, it's just growing up. Now, on a less downer note, there is a lot I want to talk about with episode 6, which I think is notable. As we exist in the modern age, anime has many different ways of imparting the idea of the flashback to the viewer, most common of which is putting a white filter over the screen and calling it a day, which leaves very little to the imagination. And with the white filter technique's growing popularity, I can't help but feel it's become an increasingly stale and lazy way of indicating past events. Now, while Manabi Straight will succumb to these techniques every once in a while, probably for the sake of just having the easiest way of showing to the viewer that it is the past, there is one place in the setting that the show will not result to the lowest common denominator in indicating past events, and that's the student council room. The audience knows that the student council room looked like a crap heap before episode 2, so the show staff respects the audience's intelligence enough that they don't have to put up an ugly white filter just so they make sure you really get it. This, of course, leads me into a discussion about the color scheme of the show, which even I'll admit is more thematically relevant to the first half more so than the second. You'll notice that even when the setting takes place in an open, well-lit area, the colors are always somewhat muted and gray, despite a relatively happy atmosphere in the show. But then there's shows like K-On!, Lucky Star, and Tomoko Market which have nailed the happy, vibrant color scheme, despite Lucky Star only coming one season after Manabi Straight, and K-On! Just a year. I'm pretty sure it's not due to technical limitations that Ufotable couldn't pull off a happier color scheme, and it's probably not money either. It was likely an intentional choice by the showmakers, but I can't confirm that, so don't listen to me. Episode 6, of course, is the first time I noticed this color scheme, and it really does make the emotional moments hit that much harder for me than if the show adopted the color schemes of, say, Kyoto Animation. Anyway, on to episode 7. Or wait, no, sorry, episode 6.5, my bad. Episode 6.5 serves as a transition between the largely tonal and atmospheric nature of the first 6 episodes and the more thematically determined final half of the show. If you haven't noticed by now, Manabi Straight takes place in a futuristic society, 2035 Japan, and its vision of the future is very modest, at least compared to shows like Code Geass. This is the first episode to really focus on the society that comes with this jump in time, and the new mindset this foreign setting brings with it, which I at least find is the most interesting part of the show. The gist of this future is that there are more jobs to go around, and because of that, people generally gain insight into where they want to go in their lives before they go into high school. So often, they head off on their own careers without really considering education. This leads to the people actually bothering to go to high school to become a minority in the society. Which is why the people who do go to high school don't take it very seriously and resort to a principally sedentary nature. There's also this stereotype floating around that high schoolers are just carefree, slovenly creatures too lazy to get a job. You know, the same kind of millennial bitching my generation is used to. So the stereotype calling students lazy is also what leads them to not take their school life very seriously. This is a perfect example of a socioeconomic catch-22. And this very sentiment is floating around when Mutsuki is running in the streets, and she's quite understandably offended by this. Later in the episode, we come to understand that those who didn't go to high school and the ones who did have completely different ideals on what the appeal of high school is. When Mika is talking to the hotel keeper's daughter, who never went to high school, the daughter suggests that there wasn't a noble reason she didn't go to high school, just that she knew what she wanted to do with her life and decided to rush into it as fast as she could. Her entire perception of high school is that it's just a place people go to so they can figure out what they want to do career-wise. She perceives high school as a place of indecision and patience. 2 attributes she of course lacked. What's funny is that she chose her place in life entirely due to haste, and even when she's attempting to be nice and consoling to Mika, there's always an air of superiority coming from her. The daughter's mother, of course, actually did bother going to high school, and when talking to Mika actually says that there's more to high school than her daughter lets on, which due to thematic reasons, the show decides she has to keep a secret from Mika. But with the context of the later part of the series, I can guess as to what she would have said. Another notable thing about this episode is that it's a beach episode. Without a beach, that is. Instead, it's with a pool. Manabi and gang are having a conversation about the season of summer, which is pretty philosophical or linguistic depending on how you look at it. Mei postulates that summer isn't really different from any other season, it just comes with more heat, and that the sentimentality that comes with summer is really only the fault of those who are easily influenced by their environments. Obviously she didn't say it like that, but that's against the point. Manabi doesn't look at summer like that at all though. She postulates that summer gets its sentimental edge from the symbols people associate it with, like summer ice cream, the beach, all that jazz. Both of these mindsets, of course, highlight specific characteristics of the characters who hold them. Mei being generally objective, who on a large part doesn't buy into sentiment, while Manabi is a person who engulfs herself in the sentiments that encompass whatever she is focused on at that moment. Anyway, on to the actual episode 7, I promise. The entirety of episode 7 has an outright suffocating foreboding tone to it, like it's spending all of its time lulling the audience into a false sense of security before punching them straight in the gut with the episode's conclusion. Many of the scenes in this episode have a dearth of dialogue or even noise at all, besides of course the occasional cicada chirping, quiet before the storm if you will. Knowing what the show is building up to has done nothing but improve my perception of this episode. The experience of watching it a second time is nothing if not nerve-wracking as hell. With all the work to do and all the quiet that's necessary to do it, our cast is more on edge than they've ever been. Manabi has an outright mental breakdown. Mika, having had experience in losing friends before, can do nothing but see the end of Manabi and company as they all slowly lose their minds. Of course, it turns out that they're all just a little under the heat. The point is that this episode is intense. To come back to a point I made at the beginning of this video, I think the strengths of the first part of the series mostly lie in stellar directing and visual metaphors, as you've probably noticed by now as I've spent the majority of my time talking about the scene construction and implications that come with the pictures on the screen. Keeping that in mind, episode 1 through 6.5 served mostly as a build-up to the conflict that spans the rest of the show. They exist primarily to get us involved in these characters, and make sure we're on board as the show escalates into a battle of values, sentimentality versus bureaucracy, long-standing values versus new and efficient methods of education. So while the first part is great for its directing, the second part of the series is strong for the aptitude with which it handles its thematic goals. And having said that, let's talk about the conclusion of episode 7. Takako visits Manabi and gang bearing news that she isn't able to share with them. She looks almost heartbroken when Manabi is telling her her plans for the student council, where she plans to have the stalls and vendors placed, and all the while what Takako knows, and Manabi is blissfully ignorant of, is the fact that the Seo school fair is going to be cancelled due to the superintendent's orders, as Seo and Aiko High will be merged in order to account for the incredibly tiny student population. The superintendent will become an important character later in the show as Manabi and gang will fight vigorously against her ruling, but her rationale for making the ruling is what I find especially interesting, as her reasoning is very typical for her society. Her outlook is that people going into the workforce are having fun doing what they're doing, but they at the very least are productive members of society, and she doesn't value fun in high schools. Since students aren't producing anything in the technical sense, she doesn't believe they should be having fun in the technical sense. She views high school, like others in her society do, as just a prep for the real world, holding no real value itself. She argues that since high school is just a temporary time for people to come to understand their goals in life, it should be, and pardon the pun, more business than casual. Because of this, the superintendent is more on board with the very hollow and shallow endeavors that make up most of Aiko's school fairs. What the audience will come to understand as this narrative goes deeper and deeper is that it never occurs to the superintendent that even though events like the school fair are temporal and finite, the memories that are left with the students can perhaps be left with them for the rest of their lives, and in the best of cases, span multiple generations. We're not here to moralize though, not yet anyway. I think it's time we move on to episode 8. This episode is when Seo gets the announcement that they won't be having their school fair, and everyone, especially Manabi and gang, feel betrayed. The first instinct of Manabi is to revolt, until of course Mei reins her in and recommends they all cool down and just try to gather signatures so they might be able to convince the superintendent, whose name is Kyoko, to overturn her decision. What's worth noticing is the kind of hype Manabi and gang can drum up when they need to around the school. Throughout the entire show, anytime Manabi and gang have asked for support from the student body, they have been more than helpful. What's also worth noticing is that anytime Manabi and gang have needed the student populace for anything, it has never required more than a day's effort. So hubris is what causes Manabi to think that if something they need done takes more than a day, that the student populace will be just as forthcoming with their help. Of course, the reality of the society they live in, the one where the students' sloth and laziness take priority after only a day's work, hits them right in the gut. By the second day of their petition campaign, they have completely lost the momentum they had. Manabi goes home, awestruck, really only brightened up by the fact that her brother has a girlfriend suddenly, only to be absolutely livid when she discovers his girlfriend is the very same superintendent that has screwed her out of the school fair she has been working on for the entire series. At this point, Manabi is surrounded on all fronts by people who are in direct opposition to her goals. She was promised a chance to bond the student populace under friendship with the school fair, and the administration took that away from her. When she put faith in the student populace to help her get them their fare back, they abandoned her after only one day. She can't even go into her own home without facing betrayal from the family member closest to her. The odds are stacked infinitely against her, and there is something fundamentally unfair about what is happening here. When she gets her meeting with the superintendent, she demands a reason why she's being denied her opportunity. If she's gonna be screwed over, she may as well be given a damn reason for it. The superintendent's response is predictably infuriating to Manabi, because it's just a fun little event that has nothing to do with the duty of the students. Manabi points out that the term duty of the students is too vague to just toss around without expecting criticism. What's happening here is the meeting and conflict between two opposite viewpoints on how duty should be defined. The superintendent, in all likelihood, believes that the duty of the students is to come to understand what they want to do with their lives as quickly as possible, and to move on with their jobs afterwards. She takes a very mechanical and business-like approach to education. The best comparison to this outlook is the American education system, which is built from the ground up like a conveyor belt, popping out graduates without care for whether or not those students have come away with any knowledge that could actually guide them through their lives. Manabi looks at this and sees the volatile idea for what it is. In all likelihood, what Manabi believes the duty of the students is to simply enjoy their time in high school, make memories, and not let the short amount of time they have before they must join the workforce to be in vain. Obviously, this is a very cliche way of thinking about high school, the carpe diem approach, but what Manabi Straight is trying to get the audience to understand is that even this outlook, this incredibly hokey outlook, is better than the shallow, outright harmful philosophy pushed by the superintendent. But at this point, it doesn't matter. The superintendent deals a fatal blow to Manabi's argument. She mentions that only the student council seems to care if there is a school fair or not. Thankfully, however, she decides to compromise. If Manabi can't get 70% of the student populace to sign the petition to get the school fair back in a week, then she will no longer have a right to complain about it, and the decision is final. But, and this is a big but, if she can get the signatures she needs, Seo can have their school fair. Manabi and gang don't have a large chance of succeeding, but they do have one thing they didn't have before: a chance. On to episode 9. Episode 9 sets up a dichotomy between nostalgia for the past and flying toward the future. The most obvious example I can give is the fact that the new hip school anthem is literally called Fly to the Future, and it's replacing the school anthem us as viewers have come to love as the series has gone on. The fact that the student populace actually likes what is obviously a shallow attempt at appealing to the largest number of people possible is just the icing on the cake. Before this point, the show's themes had more or less focused on sentimentality versus establishment, but this episode widens the lens of the show's thematic targets, to be more broadly applied to those who seek rampant progress without considering what they want to progress to. The show provides the example of the school's principal when she was a student of Seo in 2005, and the dorm room which she felt welcome in from the moment she was greeted at the door. Due to progress, her dorm building was going to be abandoned, and she and all her roommates protested the establishment that was taking away the symbol of friendship and comfort from them. They fought hardly, put up an excellent resistance, and failed. The fact that the show recognizes failure as a very real possibility, with fights like these ones against apathetic bureaucrats, makes its thematic goal hit that much harder with the introduction of a previous failure. To voice my own opinion on the matter, I think it's worth pointing out that almost anything has symbolic meaning to somebody, and that while nothing can last forever, when you tear something down in the hopes of progression, you are tearing down memories, which are not worthless and worth preserving in some sense. I don't think everyone has to be satisfied, I'm all too familiar with the slippery slope fallacy, but god damn it if you're not going to at least try. This episode also convinces me that Momo is meant to be a character that works as an audience surrogate. She has very little character herself, not a sin in this instance, as it's cleverly implemented. She mostly just documents what the other characters are doing with her camera, and lots of shots in the show are shown very deliberately to come from Momo's camera work. The only really distinct thing about her as a character is that she refuses to publish lies on the school website. And again, this isn't a bad thing, as it leads to the most emotionally powerful moment in the entire series. Momo realizes, just like the audience does, what a travesty this new and hip school anthem is, and just like the audience, she's calling out to the student body to remember the perfectly good school anthem they already had. She uses all the footage necessary to show them that what they had meant something. She's obviously panicking at the realization that she's been caught in her act of going against the school, but she puts up one last agonizing effort to show the school what they're throwing away. She just needed to convince a few students that what they already have is worth protecting, and then the goal Manabi and gang are working so hard for can gain traction and branch out from there. If she can do that, then it's a victory. Is any of this sentiment told to the audience watching? No, it's felt. We feel desperation from Momo. We feel the tension of the situation. And we can feel the triumph that our protagonists feel when they gain the support they need at the end of the episode. Well, I personally don't agree with either side of the positions this show is presenting, because I think both sides are extreme positions to take. I do recognize when a show knows how to present its position with strength. When I see this episode, I can easily ignore the fact that blindly clinging to the past based on nothing but sentiment is just as damning as stretching one's hand toward the future based on nothing but a vague feeling of progress. I can ignore this because I feel what the characters are saying, and on some deep, fundamental, and easily influenced part of myself, I understand them and want them to win. I'm rooting for them. When a show breaks through my largely cynical shell to make me feel something passionately, I think that makes a show special. On to episode 10. This episode gives the audience the conclusion to the conflict that has kept us all on the edge of our seats since the end of episode 7. It's weird how the destruction of Clock Tower brought about the unification of an entire school, and the revitalization of hopes once thought ground to death. When Manabi takes advantage of the clock's death to appeal to the student populace's sense of nostalgia, which by now is expected of her, she undeniably captivates the crowd. The few students they've enlisted to help them with their collection of signatures have aided them greatly. And while at this point they only have 32% of the student base's signatures, this episode is still all about how they pull themselves out of the rut they've been in. The motif this episode pushes is the revitalization of hopes once thought ground to death, and it works on two levels. On one hand, Manabi and gang get their school fare back, and it's a glorious emotional moment precisely because it was starting to feel like a lost cause. But the second level it works on is far more interesting to me. The principal of Seo was a student of the school once, and she brings all the happy memories and emotional baggage that comes with being a Seo alumni. When she sees her previous dorm, the one that she loved 30 years ago, and the one that has been abandoned and has become a crap heap since, when she sees it return to its former glory, it comes to be a nostalgic feeling legitimized by what is in front of her. This is an episode much like 2 and 5 for me, but probably the best of the episodes I don't have much to say about. While I do have small problems with it, for instance, I don't like how the end feels very anticlimactic as the resolution to a 4-episode conflict, I think the relatively uplifting tone, its callbacks to episodes 1 and 2, and the two methods with which its motifs are delivered just make this episode's strengths feel a lot more noticeable than its flaws. On to the penultimate episode 11. We're almost done, everybody. We've come far from this point, haven't we? When I look back at what I've written, I can't help but be impressed with myself. Not only is this by far the best thing I've ever written, it's also the longest thing I've ever written, and the care I've put into the script baffles me. While I do think that the limited vocabulary of myself may have hindered the more poetic moments I was trying to get across, I think that for this exact moment, I have surpassed all the expectations I've held for myself, and a moment of self-congratulation never hurt anyone. And that's really what episode 11 is all about. Self-congratulation after a long journey full of tribulations. wins, a battle well fought, and after all is said and done, the story's conclusion feels like it's miles away from its incitement. Everyone has come far in this show, and everyone comes to realizations about life they'd never even considered beforehand. Takaka was always unfamiliar with how fun and enjoyment worked, seeing as how she was always surrounded by the most depressing atmosphere. But in this episode, we see just how far Takaka has come. This is the first time she shows consistent emotion in front of Manabi and gang in the whole show, and she's finally learned how to smile. Mika had always questioned how Manabi could be so happy during events that everyone else would consider banal, how Manabi held herself with so much optimism during what Mika considers to be boring and everyday events. What Mika comes to realize in this episode is that Manabi is able to just be in complete awe at the fact that in such a vast and expansive universe, with infinite galaxies and stars, the fact that 5 students could have just completed preparations for a school fair to take place in a high school called Seio is exactly why she's excited. The fact that the thing's happening right now to Manabi, the fact that anything is happening at all, is precisely the reason she can always find something exciting and wonderful to be happy about. For the first time, Mika understands this, and it makes for just such a powerfully genuine, emotional moment. The superintendent comes to a revelation concerning her way of looking at fun, dumb, and banal activities that ultimately don't contribute anything to society. What she always thought was that the school was a way to prepare students for the real world, which never had the kinds of fun, banal moments you see in schools, so in an effort to make school more preparatory, she just thought it was more useful to take those fun, banal events out of the equation. However, what she comes to realize in this episode is that high school is the last place that gives anyone the opportunity to have fun, be rebellious, or just do stupid shit for the fun of it. These moments are to be treasured for how quick they can pass by and not dismissed for their admittedly useless nature, but instead remembered for it. This is the last school fair of Seio, and while even the principal admits that on a surface level, this school fair really isn't better than any of the other ones that have been held over the year, it's the context that comes with this event, and the charisma that surrounds the entire school. It's those things that make it special. This school fair will always be remembered as the one the students fought for, and even after the merger between Seio and Aiko is to happen, it will likely be remembered by every participant in the event for years to come. Everyone, we've come to the final episode, and thank you all for sticking around this far if you have. What comes with the final episode is the anxiety that after this, I'm done. This show I've been obsessing over. I'll have said all I could about it. And while I have vague plans of what I want to do with my channel after this, and even a complete video I just need to re-record, I'm not sure if it'll be a while before I follow up this little opus with something comparable, or if I'll ever have one. Anxiety for the future plagues myself and Mika. Mika has always been a character that went along with everyone else, that never put much thought into how she would act by her lonesome, or how she would be spending her future away from the people who engulfed her life these past few episodes. So when surrounded by people who know exactly what they want to do when they enter the real world, when the future comes, her own future feels foreign to her. Studying in America seems like a new and exciting thing to do with her time. One problem, she'll be doing it away from her buddies, and that scares her. What can you do though? This is what the future confronts her with. She's leaving on her own and has to survive somehow. And look at this, a year and a half later she's still alive. There's a kind of irony rampant in episode 12, as Manabi and gang fought so strongly in order to prevent the future from interfering with their present, and now that their future is looking them straight in the face with nothing else to look forward to besides graduation, they just kind of have to deal with it. Everyone has to say goodbye, their lives separate, and we as the audience have nothing but an assurance that everyone will stay together till the end. I'll wait to see all of you in my next video, whenever that comes out. Just know I really respect you for sticking around, and thank you.
人生の旅は終わっていない。それは始まったばかり。それは君の心の中で起きる。もし君に勇気があるのならば。君は魔法の飲み物はいらない。君に必要なの。ほっぺに風の吹きすを感じること。
Did you know that this is the best video review of Manabi Straight? I did because it's the only one on YouTube.